Okay, let's talk some more about confounding factors in general. And one thing, what we want to do now is really think about what makes something, at least a potential confounding factor, kind of storytelling about why something might be and what we need to look for. And if our story is correct, how how adjusting for that would change the conclusions that we can draw from our study. So, potential confounders. Here's a topic for a study. We have this question, are organic foods actually good for you? Do they make you healthier in some way? So one real study, looked at whether feeding mostly organic food to young children was associated with a lower rate of allergies and eczema among those children. A medical word that you're going to see on some of these slides is atopy. Atopy is signs that indicate that you have a tendency to be allergic. That's a food type allergy to some certain foods. So when you see atopy, just think allergy. Eczema is a sort of a rash or other skin problem, which is similarly an allergic or autoimmune association. So you don't have to worry about exactly what these things mean, but they are things that some people would think that organic foods might protect against. So the study was a prospective cohort study. They enrolled a bunch of families with very young children, followed them for a while, tracking what they were eating, and looked at the outcomes of allergies and eczema. So in this case, our exposure is eating a lot of organic food. Our unexposed group is eating a basically conventional diet. And we're actually wondering, in this case, primarily wondering whether the exposure is protective. Does it reduce the rates of allergies? So kind of wondering if we're going to get a low relative risk or odds ratio or whatever. So I'd like you to think, can you think of two possible confounding factors? And for each one, I'd like you to explain, that is sort of make up a story for what could make this a confounding factor. You need to explain why it's associated with the exposure, and separately why it's associated with the outcome. So why don't you go do that on the form and then come back. Okay, here's one that I thought of. What if you have a family history of allergies? If your family has a history with food allergies, they tend to run in families, so that certainly would likely be associated with the outcome, with the kid having a greater chance of allergies. It might also be that if you have a family history of allergies, you're nervous about them, you're more aware, you're paying attention, whatever. So maybe you're more likely to feed your kid organic food in the hopes that you will reduce their chance of allergies. So if this is the case, then how would this change your conclusion? If you somehow adjusted for this confounding factor, how would you expect your measures of association to change? Again, go answer on the Google form. Okay. Here's the way I look at it. Let's say we have somebody with a family history of allergies who tends to feed their kid organics, and their kid is more likely to have allergies. So that would make it look like the organics caused the allergies when it was actually the family history of allergies doing it. So in this case, that family history of allergies, if our story is correct, and we don't know that, but if it's correct, then our family history of allergies would kind of hide a protective aspect of eating organics. So if we corrected for the family history of allergies, we might expect the relative risk of the odds ratio to go down, possibly moving from bigger than 1 to smaller than 1, or possibly ending up more protective than it was originally. Or, maybe it's not protective, but we would expect it to decrease. Let's think about another potential confounding factor, exposure to tobacco smoke. Now, a kid who's exposed to tobacco smoke might be more likely to have allergies, eczema, other situations like this. And it would make sense. You would think that people who smoked around their kid were probably less likely to feed their kid organic food. So again, I don't know for sure, but this is a plausible potential confounder. So I want you to think, if my story is correct, how would correcting for this confounder, adjusting for this confounder, change your conclusion? Again, give me an answer on the Google form. Here's my answer. People who smoke around their kids are less likely to feed their kids organics, and their kids are more likely to have allergies, that will make it look like it was, or let's say that the other way. People who don't smoke are more likely to feed their kids organics and less likely to have kids with allergies. So that would make it look like the organics were protective when it was actually the sort of people who don't smoke. And the people who do smoke, less likely to feed organic, more likely to have allergies, again, will make it look like the lack of organics hurt. So the crude measure of association will show a lower risk of allergies among the kids who eat organic than you would see after adjusting. Adjusting in this case would increase the size of the relative risk. So if organics are protective, the relative risk would move closer to 1. There will be less of an effect due to organics than we would see if we hadn't thought about tobacco smoke. So those are the sorts of things we think about when we're looking at potential confounders. You have a PDF that I shared with you, which is data from this actual study. This was done in the Netherlands. I pretty much explained what it was. They looked at 3 different exposure groups: the people who ate conventional food, who fed their kids conventional food, that is less than half organics. That's the reference in the unexposed group. The people who fed their kids a moderately organic diet, which was between 50 and 90% organic, and the people who fed their kids a strictly organic diet, which in this case was over 90% organic. So I want you to go look at those slides, at the first page of those slides for all. You're probably going to need to pause this and open up that PDF and zoom in on it. Just kind of look at it and get your bearings and look at a bunch of different exposures that they considered. Okay? When you're looking at that table, that really long table one, you saw those 3 exposure groups, and go look at it again, and you'll see that table 1 shows a lot of different potential confounders that they might have considered. So these are all sorts of different things that they collected data on for each of our 3 exposure groups. I want you to look at 2 of them in particular: the parental history of allergies and the exposure to tobacco smoke, and try to figure out what this slide is telling you, what this table is telling you, excuse me. Okay. If you look at that carefully, you should see that the potential history of allergies actually doesn't look like a confounder, because each exposure group, the conventional food people, the moderately organic food, and the strictly organic food people, all had about the same rate of a parental history of allergies. About 50% of each exposure group had no family history. So it turns out that the parental history of allergies was not actually associated with the exposure, so it's not a confounding factor. You thought it might be, it really isn't an important one. Whereas if you look at environmental tobacco, that still looks like it might be an important confounder, because 14% of the conventional food kids had environmental exposure to tobacco smoke, only 4% of the mostly organic kids, and only 1% of the strictly organic food kids. So there was a big difference there. So we have environmental tobacco associated with the exposure. That kind of means we should at least be thinking about whether it is a confounder for this study. Again, go look back at that table one more time and try to find an additional exposure that at least might be a confounder, and one more that looks like it isn't. And again, explain what you found in the form. The other 2 tables that I gave you show the results of the study, and I know they're sideways. I couldn't easily get them turned around. Hopefully you can either, turn your head sideways or turn your screen sideways or something like that. I'd like you to take a look at these on your own and notice if they show both an unadjusted odds ratio, that's a crude odds ratio calculated just like we already know how to do, and an adjusted odds ratio. By the way, even though this was a cohort study, they used odds ratios, not relative risk, because the sort of statistics they wanted to do this adjusting needed the odds ratio, just by the way. So the adjusted odds ratio, they used some fancy statistics, multilinear regression, to correct for a whole bunch of confounders all at once. They corrected for sex, boys versus girls, maternal level of education, uh, BMI. I think that's of the, I'm not sure if that's of the parents or the kids actually. Parental history of allergy, even though we said it didn't look like a confounder, they figured they might as well correct for it. Sibling history of allergy, number of older siblings, breastfeeding, daycare attendance, pets, are there pets in the house? And the one we talked about, the exposure to environmental tobacco. So just take a look at those tables and you can see the adjusted and the unadjusted odds ratios are slightly different. They're not hugely different. For both of them, we have confidence intervals. And just as we've been doing all along, you would be asking yourself, when is one inside the confidence interval? Because if one is in the confidence interval, then we think that there really is some association in this case between eating organic and allergies. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. If one is not in the confidence interval, if the confidence interval is either purely smaller than one or purely larger than one, then we would think there would be an association. And so take a look at it and see if you think there is anything convincing about a health effect of organic food in here. What I saw when I looked at is that organic milk consumption really did look like it was associated with lower rates of eczema. That confidence interval was purely less than one, even after they adjusted for the confounding factors, and there were no other clear associations. All the other confidence intervals contained one. I think there was one that just went up to 0.99 and didn't quite contain one, but close enough. So that's the way we talk about potential confounders. Another question we're going to want to ask is, what sort of study designs are good at helping us avoid having to deal with confounding factors? And I'm just going to introduce this. We'll pick up more in the next slide. How about case control studies? No, case control studies certainly aren't very good. The moped study was a case control study, and as we saw, helmet use was a huge issue there. Okay, how about cohort studies? Again, no. This organics and allergy study was a cohort study, and issues of tobacco smoke were a huge confounding factor there. So we have to ask, what other study designs do we have where our goal is to avoid having these other incidental differences between the exposed and the unexposed group? And that's the topic we're going to take up in the next set of slides, in the next recording. Bye for now.